Hello, and welcome back to the Eastern Historian's Bedtime Stories. I'm Jason. Tonight we're going to follow a story that lasted for more than 2,000 years. In September of AD 476, in Ravenna in northern Italy, there was no thunder, no earthquake, and no last legion standing on the walls. Inside the palace, a teenage boy took off the purple robe and surrendered the objects that symbolized imperial power. Odoacer, the man who controlled the army, did not kill him. He gave him an allowance and sent him south to live out his remaining years. The next morning, bakers lit their ovens as usual. Merchants opened their shops. Churches held their prayers. Most people in the city of Rome did not even realize that later generations would call the previous day the fall of the Western Roman Empire. That is one of the most fascinating things about Roman history. How could an empire that had turned the Mediterranean into an inland sea and made the rainy mists of Britain and the deserts of Egypt answer to the same command fail to collapse with a roar? Why did it instead come to a quiet end in something that looked almost like an administrative handover? Stranger still, although the empire disappeared, its shadow remains everywhere, in law, language, roads, architecture, religion, and the institutions of government. Even the peoples who overthrew Rome competed to inherit Rome. To understand why, we cannot look only at the last emperor, and we cannot place all the blame on one tyrant or one so-called barbarian army. The true story of Rome is the story of how a small city learned to turn defeat into strength, enemies into allies, and allies into Romans. Its real ending began when that ability slowly stopped working. If this slow walk through Roman history helps the noise in your mind quietly recede, then a like and a subscription would be the gentlest kind of company. But there is no need to force it. Only do so if you truly enjoy what we are creating here. Tonight, there is no pressure at all. You may also leave your city and the current time in the comments. It is a tiny gesture, but like a point of light in the dark. It can help other sleepless listeners find this quiet corner. Just imagine it. Strangers in different cities, all listening to the same story at the same moment. There is something deeply comforting in that distant sense of connection. Now, let yourself sink into something soft and comfortable. Dim the room to a warm, gentle glow. And slowly, let yourself drift into the vast and ancient story of Rome. Our story begins beside the Tiber River. According to legend, royal twin brothers were placed in a basket and abandoned on the water, where a she-wolf found and nursed them. When the brothers grew up, they decided to build a city. But they quarreled over power, and Romulus killed Remus. The new city was therefore named Rome. The tale may not be a factual record, but it sounds almost like an ominous prophecy. Rome could gather strangers together, yet again and again, at the height of its strength, it would turn against its own brothers. Archaeology reveals a slower and less dramatic picture. The Tiber was easy to cross at this point. A salt road passed nearby. The 7 hills offered natural defense. Settlements of Latins, Sabines, and Etruscans gradually grew together. Rome's traditional founding day was probably less a single moment than a commemorative marker later generations placed on a long process of urban growth. Rome did not rise from empty land overnight. It grew out of transportation, trade, warfare, and intermarriage. Its location was not perfect, but it was extremely useful. Rome stood close enough to the sea to take part in Mediterranean trade, but not directly on the coast, which reduced the danger of pirate raids. The Tiber linked the interior to the river mouth, while the surrounding hills provided natural defenses. Romans later liked to say that destiny had chosen them. Geography, at the very least, gave destiny an easy way in. If you could walk into the earliest Rome, the first thing you would smell would not be perfume or exotic spices. It would be livestock. Wet earth would smoke in open drains. Houses of timber and mud bricks stood on the hills. The low ground flooded during the rainy season, and the place that would later become the Forum began as something closer to a muddy hollow. Little by little, the city dug channels, laid roads, built walls, and transformed shared spaces for markets into stages for worship, trials, and political display. Rome would later tell its story in white marble, but it had grown out of mud. The family was the hardest shell around early Roman society. The male head of the household possessed enormous legal and economic authority. Marriages were often tied to alliances between families. Women held no formal political office, yet they could manage property, shape family relationships, and carry bloodlines and influence through aristocratic politics. Slaves came through war, debt, and trade. They worked in fields and workshops, but some also served as teachers, scribes, and household managers. At dawn, wealthy patrons opened their doors to clients, who exchanged greetings, companionship, and votes for protection and assistance. The gods lived in daily life as well. Hearths, thresholds, ancestors, boundary stones, and military standards could all be objects of reverence. From the beginning, Rome was not held together by law alone. It was a web woven from family, patronage, debt, ritual, and shared military service. Tradition lists 7 kings, from Romulus to Tarquin the Proud. The earliest kings are heavily colored by legend, while the influence of the Etruscans in the later royal period has stronger historical support. Many symbols later associated with Rome, urban drainage, temple architecture, ceremonies of kingship, and certain forms of gladiatorial and triumphal tradition, were closely connected to the Etruscan world. This matters because later generations often imagine Rome as a teacher born knowing everything. In reality, early Rome was more like a hardworking student who was never ashamed to imitate. It learned writing, art, and religious forms from Greek colonial cities. It learned elements of urban government and ceremony from the Etruscans. It adapted its army through wars against the mountain peoples of Italy. Rome's most consistent tradition was the habit of borrowing other people's traditions. Kingship did not mean that one man could simply do whatever he pleased. A king needed the support of the Senate, a council of aristocratic elders, and also depended on citizen assemblies and religious approval. Society was organized through families, clans, patronage, and status. Aristocrats controlled land, priesthoods, and political resources. Ordinary free people carried much of the burden of production and military service, while slaves remained under domination. Later Romans summarized many of these tensions as a struggle between patricians and plebeians, but reality was much messier than two neat and opposing camps. Tradition says that the last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, ruled arrogantly and without restraint. His son raped the aristocratic woman Lucretia. She took her own life, and her death inspired a revolt led by the nobles. In 509 BC, the royal family was expelled and the republic was born. The date and many details of the story were probably shaped by later writers, but Rome did undergo a real political transformation between the late 6th and early 5th centuries BC. Kingship was replaced by annually elected offices. From that point onward, king became one of the most dangerous words in Roman politics. Anyone suspected of seeking a crown could become the target of furious opposition. 5 centuries later, when Caesar lay dying in the Senate, his assassins would still claim the same justification. They had acted to prevent the rise of another king. The Roman word for republic, residential publica, meant the public business of the community. It did not mean modern equality, and it did not provide universal representative government. The Roman Republic was a mixed political system. Two consuls held the highest executive and military authority. They served for 1 year and restrained one another. The Senate, made up largely of former senior officials and aristocratic elites, held enormous influence over experience, finance, and foreign policy. Citizen assemblies elected officials, passed laws, and decided on war, but voting structures generally favored the wealthy. The cleverness of the system did not lie in eliminating ambition. It lay in building a track on which ambition could run. Aristocratic men competed for offices such as quaestor, aedile, praetor, and consul. They accumulated glory through military victory, public construction, courtroom speeches, and family prestige. Everyone wanted to outshine everyone else, but they had to do it through shared rules. As long as enough members of the elite believed, "My turn may come next year," the Republic could continue to function. Imagine an election during the Republic. A candidate walks through the forum wearing a specially whitened toga. He takes hand after hand, while an assistant whispers the names, families, and needs of the people approaching him. Orators climb onto the speaker's platform, point to trophies won by their ancestors, and without hesitation expose every old scandal of their opponents. Wealthy men arrive with crowds of dependents. Rural citizens travel into the city to vote. Yet the votes are not simply added together as one person, one vote. They are counted through property-based groups and voting units. There is competition here, but there is also money, intimidation, banquets, favors, and obligation. The Republic did not eliminate manipulation. It placed manipulation inside procedures that everyone could see and, at least for the moment, had to recognize. The truly dangerous point would come not when one politician became too ambitious, but when more and more people decided that waiting for the next election was less efficient than killing an opponent. Ordinary citizens were not powerless. Early Rome experienced a long struggle known as the conflict of the orders. Plebeians pressured the elite by refusing military service and withdrawing collectively from the city. They won the creation of the tribunes of the plebs, their own assembly, the right to intermarry, and eventual access to senior offices. The person of a tribune was declared sacred and inviolable, and tribunes could use the veto to protect plebeians. In the middle of the 5th century BC, the 12 Tables placed parts of Roman law in public view, reducing the aristocracy's control over unwritten rules. But this should not be told as a simple story of the people steadily defeating oppression. As rights expanded, wealthy plebeian families gradually merged with old patrician families to form a new governing elite. Slaves, women, and many outsiders still lacked political equality. The Republic's liberty of the citizen rested on rigid hierarchy, patriarchal households, and compulsory military duty. In 390 or 387 BC, a Gallic army defeated the Romans and entered the city. Later legend claimed that geese on the Capitoline Hill woke the defenders and saved the final stronghold. Whatever the exact details, the disaster left a deep scar on Roman memory. Yet Rome did not retreat behind its walls. Instead, over the following century, it transformed the memory of defeat into a new and even more intense capacity for organization. Rome's unification of Italy was not an uninterrupted march of conquest. It was a chain of wars, treaties, betrayals, and reorganizations. Rome defeated the Latin League, fought 3 Samnite Wars, and then faced the Greek cities of southern Italy and their ally, King Pyrrhus of Epirus. Pyrrhus won several battles, only to discover that Rome kept replacing its losses. His own casualties could not easily be replaced, while Rome drew new soldiers from a vast network of citizens and allies. The phrase Pyrrhic victory later came to mean a victory so costly that it was almost a defeat. Rome's greatest strategic advantage was not one invincible formation. It was selective integration. Different cities received different treatment. Some gained full citizenship. Some received limited rights. Some kept local autonomy, but had to provide troops. In other places, Rome founded Roman or Latin colonies. It did not demand that all of Italy immediately become the same kind of society. Instead, it built an unequal network of rights and obligations with Rome at the center. The network was harsh, but flexible. Conquered communities often lost control of foreign policy and had to fight in Rome's wars. Yet local elites could gain status, and ordinary men might share in the benefits of military service and eventual citizenship. Rome did not push every defeated population into hopelessness. It left at least some people a ladder into the system. The army was changing as well. The early property-based heavy infantry gradually developed into a more flexible legionary structure, able to commit forces and stages across the rough landscape of Italy. Roman soldiers were not always braver than Samnites or Greeks, but the Republic could recruit, tax, build roads, and establish colonies year after year, turning any single battle into part of a much longer war of endurance. Whenever a legion stopped for the night, the soldiers did not simply lie down wherever they wished. They measured the ground, dug ditches, raised palisades, and divided the camp with orderly roads. Every unit had a roughly assigned place. The next morning, this temporary wooden city could be dismantled and carried onward. Such training allowed an army of farmers to create order quickly, even in unfamiliar territory. And behind the legion came slower but more lasting weapons: roads, bridges, colonies, and population records. Roads moved orders and armies. Colonies were driven into strategic locations like nails. Treaties recorded how many soldiers each community owed to Rome's account of war. A defeated city might lose part of its land without being completely destroyed. Its aristocrats might continue to govern locally, while its young men were required to march with Roman armies. A few years later, they could be bleeding beside Roman soldiers. Their children might receive a higher status. The system was unequal, and it often depended on coercion and punishment, but it created lasting obedience more effectively than simple plunder. Rome did not conquer Italy merely because its legions advanced. It conquered Italy because after every war, it rearranged who belonged inside the community and who remained outside it. By 264 BC, Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula. It still had no great navy and no experience managing an overseas empire. Across the strait, wealthy Carthage dominated Western Mediterranean trade and naval power. The two states would soon collide in Sicily. When Rome stepped outside Italy for the first time, no one could know whether the sea would swallow it whole. Punic was the Roman word for the Phoenician people of Carthage. Carthage stood in North Africa and had grown from the Phoenician colonial tradition. It possessed a mature commercial network, deep naval experience, and overseas strongholds. Rome and Carthage were not natural, eternal enemies. In earlier centuries, they had even signed treaties. The immediate cause of conflict was a group of mercenaries in Messana, in northeastern Sicily. They appealed for help to both Rome and Carthage, and a local crisis was taken over by two great powers. The First Punic War began in 264 BC. Rome was skilled on land, but now it had to send soldiers onto an unfamiliar sea. Ancient writers claim that the Romans copied a stranded Carthaginian warship and quickly built a fleet. The story may be too neat, but Rome did create a large navy in a remarkably short time. It also used a hooked boarding bridge, the Corvus, which allowed Roman troops to turn some naval battles into something closer to infantry combat at sea. But the sea did not care about political speeches. Storms and poor seamanship destroyed Roman fleets on a terrifying scale. More men may have died in shipwrecks than in many battles. A more ordinary state might have asked for peace. Rome rebuilt its fleets again and again. In 241 BC, it won near the Aegates Islands. Carthage surrendered Sicily and agreed to pay an indemnity. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. Victory also revealed a new Roman identity. Rome now began directly governing overseas territory, sending officials to collect taxes, judge disputes, and manage populations that did not belong to the Italian alliance system. The Republic had changed from an Italian hegemon into a maritime empire, without yet developing enough moral or institutional restraint for the transformation. Carthage soon fell into the mercenary war. Rome took advantage of its weakness to seize Sardinia and Corsica and demanded an additional payment. To Carthaginians, this did not look like a fair treaty. It looked like a strong state exploiting a wounded rival. The hatred was postponed, not erased. The Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca turned his family's ambitions toward the Iberian Peninsula. Rich mines and new sources of manpower helped Carthage recover. In 219 BC, Hamilcar's son Hannibal captured Saguntum, a city allied with Rome. The Second Punic War began. Hannibal did not attack in the way Rome expected. He marched from Iberia, crossed the Rhone, and then led his army over the Alps. Cold, mountain paths, hostile tribes, and shortages steadily reduced his force. The elephants did not stroll comfortably through the snow as they do in heroic paintings. But when Hannibal suddenly appeared in northern Italy, the strategic shock was complete. Rome had been forced to fight on its own soil. At the Tiber River in 218 BC and at Lake Trasimene in 217, Roman armies suffered crushing defeats. The dictator Fabius Maximus adopted a strategy of avoiding major battle and harassing Hannibal's supplies. Impatient Romans mocked him as the delayer. Roman society wanted a clear, honorable victory. So in 216 BC, the Republic gathered an army of unprecedented size and met Hannibal at Cannae. That day became one of the most famous encirclements in military history. Hannibal allowed his center to bend backward, drawing the densely packed Roman infantry farther and farther forward. His stronger infantry on the wings closed in from the sides. After defeating the Roman cavalry, the Carthaginian horsemen sealed the rear. The Roman army was compressed into an ever-shrinking space. Men could barely swing their swords, and there was nowhere to escape. Ancient sources disagree sharply on the exact death toll, but tens of thousands of Roman and allied soldiers were certainly killed. Consuls, senators, and senior officers died in large numbers. If history were a game decided only by battle scores, Rome should have ended there. Several cities in southern Italy joined Hannibal. The king of Macedon allied with him. Sicily showed signs of unrest. Rome carried out emergency recruitment and even armed slaves. The Republic seemed cornered. When news of Cannae reached Rome, there was no heroic music inside the gates. There was only restrained weeping. Almost every family waited for the lists of the dead. searching for the names of husbands, sons, and brothers. The Senate feared panic. It limited the public period of mourning and posted guards at the gates. Some wanted to ransom prisoners. Some hoped Hannibal would offer terms. Rome chose an almost merciless path instead. No negotiation, no admission that the war was over, and no peace that would allow Hannibal to force the city to kneel. This did not mean that every Roman suddenly became fearless. Some fled. Some allies defected. Commanders competed for credit. Policies changed and changed again. What mattered was that the underlying network had not broken. More boys were registered for service. Slaves were armed with promises of freedom. Allied communities continued to send troops. Senators contributed private wealth. Fabius returned to his strategy of avoiding Hannibal's preferred battles, burning supplies, striking small detachments, and using time as a weapon. Hannibal remained in Italy for years and won astonishing victories, but he never saw the entire Roman alliance betray Rome at once. For the first time, the world saw that the most frightening power of a city was not the ability to avoid bleeding. It was the ability to continue taking attendance, collecting taxes, and holding elections after it had bled. The one thing Hannibal most needed never happened. Rome's alliance system did not collapse. Most of central Italy continued to supply manpower. Rome refused to negotiate and refused to exchange the prisoners of Cannae. It returned to Fabian strategy, denying Hannibal the decisive battle he wanted, while fighting simultaneously in Spain, Sicily, Italy, and at sea. This was the true strength of the Roman system. It could lose an army without losing its recruitment lists. It could lose consuls and still elect new consuls by established procedure. It could watch cities defect and still rely on colonies, roads, and allied communities. Hannibal achieved tactical miracle after tactical miracle, but he could not easily dismantle a political network that Rome had spent decades building. A young commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio carried the war back into Iberia. He captured New Carthage and destroyed the base of the Barcid family. He then landed in North Africa, forcing Hannibal to return home. At Zama, in 202 BC, Scipio defeated him and earned the name Africanus. Romans later preferred to attribute victory to courage. A more accurate explanation is that they used a larger alliance, deeper reserves of manpower, and extraordinary political determination to outlast the sharpest years of a military genius. Defeated Carthage lost its overseas territories and the right to wage war independently, yet recovered quickly through commerce. Cato the Elder was later said to end almost every speech, whatever its subject, with the demand that Carthage must be destroyed. The precise habit may have been simplified by later writers, but it captured something real in the Roman elite. Safety would never feel complete while the enemy still existed. In 149 BC, Rome declared war after Carthage fought Numidia without Roman permission. At first, the Carthaginians surrendered weapons and hostages. Rome then demanded that they abandon their city and move inland. In despair, Carthage chose resistance. The siege lasted 3 years. In 146 BC, Scipio Aemilianus broke into the city. The street fighting was brutal. Many survivors were enslaved, and Carthaginian territory became the Roman province of Africa. The popular story that Romans sowed salt over the ruins is a later legend, not securely supported by the main ancient accounts. The real history was cruel enough. It does not need extra salt. In the same year, Roman forces destroyed the rebellious Greek city of Corinth. The year 146 BC, therefore, became a symbolic dividing line. From Carthage in the western Mediterranean to the Greek world in the east, few states remained capable of challenging Rome directly. During the Second Punic War, King Philip V of Macedon had allied with Hannibal, drawing Rome into Greek affairs. In the wars that followed, Rome defeated the Macedonian phalanx. In 196 BC, the Roman commander Flamininus announced at the Greek games that the Greeks are free. The crowd erupted in celebration. At first, Rome did not always want to annex every territory directly. It preferred to break powerful states apart, support friendly governments, demand payments, and enforce obedience. But this freedom came with a condition. No one was free to oppose Rome. Local conflicts repeatedly called Rome back. Rome then used the language of order to impose deeper control. Macedonia eventually became a province. Greece was absorbed into the Roman system of power. The Seleucid Empire, after defeat, withdrew from much of Western Asia Minor. In 133 BC, King Attalus III of Pergamum died and was said to have left his kingdom to Rome. Whatever pressure stood behind the will, Rome thereby gained the wealthy territory that became the province of Asia. In the same year, a tribune named Tiberius Gracchus was beaten to death in the streets of Rome. The two events were like opposite faces of the same empire. Wealth poured inward from abroad, while the rules at home began to bleed. Conquest brought treasure, taxes, slaves, mines, grain, and commercial opportunities. Generals built private reputations out of victory. Tax contractors profited from the provinces. Aristocrats bought land. The urban population received grain and entertainment. Greek teachers, works of art, and philosophy flooded Rome. The conquerors found themselves captivated by the culture of the conquered. But the rewards were distributed very unevenly. An Italian farmer returning from years of military service might find his fields neglected and his debts accumulated. Large estates, using enslaved labor and production for the market, put pressure on small farmers in some regions. The process did not happen at the same speed everywhere, and it cannot explain every crisis by itself. Even so, questions of land, military manpower, inequality, and political representation were becoming sharper. More dangerous still, the Republic had been designed for a city-state. Officials served short terms. The administrative staff was small. Much depended on private relationships and temporary commands. Rome now ruled territories stretching from Spain to Asia Minor, yet continued to let aristocrats manage empire through elections, provincial assignments, war profits, and personal followings. Overseas war did not cool elite competition. It gave the winners wealth and armies on a scale no earlier Roman had possessed. Rome had conquered the Mediterranean, but it had not conquered its own ambition. Victory also changed the sound of Roman streets. Triumphs brought gold, silver, statues, exotic animals, and chained prisoners into the city. Crowds cheered as the victorious commander wore a laurel wreath. Behind him, tradition said someone reminded him that he was still mortal. Ships unloaded Egyptian grain, Spanish metal, Greek art, and human beings in chains. Some enslaved people were sent to mines and great estates, where life was quickly consumed. Others, especially the educated, entered wealthy households as teachers, doctors, or secretaries. Some were later freed and became freedmen. As Rome grew richer, the city increasingly resembled the entire Mediterranean compressed into one place. Yet prosperity did not fall equally on every head. A veteran might come home to discover that debt had swallowed his farm. The urban poor crowded into apartment blocks vulnerable to fire and collapse. The Italian allies fought Rome's wars without an equal voice in Roman policy. Aristocrats borrowed heavily to win elections, then used provincial governorships to repay their debts, returning with new fortunes to compete for higher office. The rules of a republic were like a clay jar made for a small city. Wealth, armies, and territory were now being poured into it in overwhelming quantities. Cracks had appeared, but the elites still argued over who had the right to carry the jar away. In 133 BC, the tribune Tiberius Gracchus proposed an agrarian law. It sought to limit how much public land one person could occupy and redistribute reclaimed land to poor citizens. His supporters argued that the decline of small farmers threatened Roman citizenship and the military levy. His opponents argued that he violated established property, bypassed the Senate, and used popular politics to pursue personal power. The dispute quickly changed from, "Is this law wise?" to "Does the other side still have a right to exist?" When Tiberius sought re-election as tribune, his senatorial enemies led their supporters into the assembly. They beat him and hundreds of followers to death with clubs, stones, and broken furniture. The bodies were thrown into the Tiber. This was not Rome's first political conflict, but it created a fatal precedent in the late Republic. Elites discovered that killing an opponent could be more effective than persuading an assembly. 10 years later, Tiberius's brother Gaius Gracchus pursued a wider program. It included grain supply, colonies, road construction, a greater role for the equestrian order and juries, and plans to expand the community of political benefit. He was better organized and a more powerful speaker, but he too challenged senatorial authority and the boundaries of citizenship. In 121 BC, the Senate passed its ultimate decree, authorizing the consul to defend the state. Gaius died in the resulting violence, and his supporters were purged. The Gracchi were not flawless modern democrats. They also used aggressive procedure and personal mobilization. Their opponents were not all cartoon villains. Some genuinely feared that charismatic leaders would manipulate the crowds and destroy the Constitution. The deeper danger was that both sides were losing the willingness to recognize their opponents as legitimate participants in shared rules. Gaius Marius came from an equestrian family in an Italian town, not from Rome's oldest nobility. He rose through military talent. He won the war against Jugurtha, and when a movement of Germanic peoples caused panic in Italy, he was elected consul repeatedly and defeated the Cimbrian Teutons. A traditional account says that in 107 BC, Marius suddenly reformed the army, recruited landless men, and created a professional force. That is too tidy. Professionalization, long service, and a recruitment of poorer citizens developed gradually, and the old levy did not disappear at once. Still, the age of Marius accelerated a real trend. More soldiers without land began to depend on their commander for settlement, booty, and future security. If a general could win land for them, their loyalty might shift from the republic to the man. At the same time, conflict between Rome and its Italian allies exploded. The allies had fought for Rome for generations, yet many still lacked full citizenship and remained politically subordinate. After the reformer Drusus was assassinated in 91 BC, allied communities rebelled in what became known as the Social War. Rome struggled militarily, but made a decisive political concession. It gradually granted citizenship to loyal or surrendering Italians. This was a classic Roman solution. Resist at first, fight until the situation nearly escapes control, and then absorb the enemy into the system. The citizen body expanded from a city to almost all of Italy. But the registration and voting arrangements for the new citizens produced another struggle for power. In 88 BC, the consul Lucius Cornelius Sulla received command of the war against King Mithridates VI of Pontus. The faction of Marius used political action to transfer the command. Sulla then made a decision without precedent in the history of the Republic. He persuaded his army to follow him and marched on Rome. The moment Roman legions crossed into the city's political heart, an ancient taboo shattered. Sulla reclaimed his command and left for the east. The Marian faction later seized Rome and carried out its own revenge. When Sulla returned, he won the civil war and appointed himself dictator for the restoration of the Republic. He published lists of enemies. Anyone could kill a listed man and receive a reward. The victim's property was confiscated. Private grudges, political murder, and financial plunder merged into a single bloody market. Sulla enlarged the Senate, weakened the tribunes, and tried to restore aristocratic order through law. Then he voluntarily retired. On the surface, he had proved that he did not intend to remain a tyrant forever. In reality, he left behind a far more dangerous lesson. A general could use his army to capture the capital, murder his enemies, rewrite the Constitution, and then declare that everything had been done for the Republic. After Sulla's death, the Republic did not regain its balance. Pirates in the Mediterranean, wars in the East, rebellion in Spain, and slave uprisings repeatedly created states of emergency. Gnaeus Pompeius, Pompey, rose with extraordinary speed through a series of special commands. He cleared the sea of pirates, defeated Mithridates, reorganized the eastern territories, and returned to Rome with immense prestige. Marcus Crassus was famous for wealth and connections. He took part in suppressing the slave revolt led by Spartacus, although Pompey would later claim a share of the final glory. Crassus gained that reputation through a war Roman society preferred not to remember. In 73 BC, a group of slaves escaped from a gladiator school at Capua. The most famous among them was Spartacus. At first, they were simply trying to survive, but they repeatedly defeated the forces sent against them, attracting runaway slaves, shepherds, and poor people. Their numbers grew rapidly. Romans were accustomed to watching enslaved people fight in the arena. Suddenly, the people they treated as entertainment had taken up weapons and were defeating consular armies. The rebels did not all share the same goal. Some wanted to cross the Alps and leave Italy. Others wanted to remain and plunder wealthy regions. Spartacus was not trying to create a modern abolitionist state. Even so, the revolt tore open the hidden foundation of Roman prosperity. Crassus restored discipline with extreme severity and was said to have revived decimation, the execution of one man in every 10. He eventually defeated the rebellion in southern Italy. Thousands of prisoners were crucified along the Appian Way from Capua toward Rome. The road famous for engineering and order became, for a time, the Republic's most direct exhibition of violence. Pompey and Crassus envied one another, yet both recognized that the Senate was unwilling to grant all their political demands. The third man was Gaius Julius Caesar. He came from an ancient patrician family, but he was deeply in debt and possessed astonishing ambition. He moved skillfully between popular politics, aristocratic society, and military opportunity. Around 60 BC, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus formed an informal alliance later called the First Triumvirate. It was not a legal government of 3 men. It was a private arrangement. Pompey wanted land for his veterans and confirmation of his eastern settlement. Crassus wanted commercial advantages. Caesar wanted the consulship and a favorable provincial command. The formal institutions of the Republic still operated. Elections were still held. The Senate still debated. Yet major decisions were increasingly made by a handful of private men who controlled wealth, armies, and organized crowds. From 58 to 50 BC, Caesar fought a series of campaigns in Gaul. He defeated numerous peoples, crossed the Rhine, invaded Britain twice, and crushed the great uprising led by Vercingetorix. At the Siege of Alesia, Caesar's army built two lines of fortifications, one facing inward against the defenders in the town, and one facing outward against the relief army. Vercingetorix eventually surrendered. Much of what we know about these campaigns comes from Caesar's own commentaries on the Gallic War. The prose is clear, restrained, and written in the third person. Caesar decided, Caesar advanced, as though it were an objective report. It was also brilliant political advertising. The conquest brought Rome wealth, slaves, and land, while causing mass killing, displacement, and social destruction. Caesar turned a frontier war into a machine for personal glory. After years of shared danger, his legions developed a powerful loyalty to him. Meanwhile, the triumvirate fell apart. Crassus was defeated and killed by the Parthians at Carrhae in 53 BC. Pompey moved closer to conservative senators. If Caesar surrendered his command and returned to Rome, he could face prosecution and political ruin. If he returned with his army, he would be committing rebellion. In 49 BC, Caesar led the 13th Legion across the Rubicon River in northern Italy. Later tradition linked the words "the die is cast" to this moment. The exact phrase is uncertain, but the symbolism is clear. Caesar had made a choice from which there was no return. Pompey and most of the senators opposed to Caesar left Italy. Caesar rapidly secured the west and defeated Pompey at Pharsalus in 48 BC. Pompey fled to Egypt, where members of the royal court murdered him. When Caesar arrived, he was presented with the head of his former ally and son-in-law. He was said to have wept. Whether the tears were sincere or theatrical, the scene looked like an accusation made by the Republic against itself. Caesar became involved in Egypt's dynastic struggle and allied with Cleopatra. He later defeated his remaining enemies in Asia Minor, North Africa, and Spain. He reformed the calendar, enlarged the Senate, settled veterans, founded colonies, adjusted debt, and gave provincial elites greater opportunity. The Julian calendar, after later correction, remains a major ancestor of the calendar used today. But the honors and authority concentrated around Caesar increasingly resembled monarchy. He became dictator for life. His portrait appeared on coins. He sat in a special chair and accepted honors approaching the divine. Romans could tolerate a ruler who was a king in practice, but they remained deeply allergic to the word. On the Ides of March in 44 BC, a group of senators calling themselves the Liberators surrounded Caesar at a meeting place beside the theater of Pompey and stabbed him to death. Brutus, Cassius, and the others believed that removing the tyrant would restore the Republic. They misunderstood their age. Caesar's power was not a spell cast by one man. It was the result of a century of social conflict, overseas wealth, armies becoming attached to commanders, emergency powers, and collapsing trust in institutions. The assassins had no coherent plan for what came next, and the Roman people did not welcome them with one voice. Caesar's gave money to Roman citizens and adopted his young great-nephew Gaius Octavius as his heir. When a 19-year-old Octavian arrived in Italy, he did not look like a hero. He was physically fragile and inexperienced. Against him stood seasoned consuls, Caesar's veteran lieutenant Mark Antony, and senators who dismissed him as child. Yet Octavian's greatest talent was not charging into battle. It was waiting for other people to make mistakes. Caesar's funeral exposed the assassin's miscalculation. Antony read the will in the forum and displayed Caesar's blood-stained clothing. The crowd's grief turned to anger. They piled up wood and burned the body, then rushed toward the houses of the conspirators. The assassins had expected gratitude for restoring liberty. Instead, they discovered that many Romans cared more about Caesar's money, settlements, and promise of order. The Republic still possessed magnificent language, but it no longer possessed a referee everyone was willing to obey. Octavian understood that. He took Caesar's name, paid the promised gifts, borrowed the loyalty of veterans, and cooperated with the Senate whenever it served him. Then he turned around and forced the Senate to grant him office. He could make yesterday's enemy today's ally and abandon that ally tomorrow. Antony knew how to ignite soldiers with passion. Octavian knew how to turn time, legality, propaganda, and the exhaustion of others into weapons. Rome's final cycle of civil wars was not only a contest between armies. It was a contest over who could present himself as the man who would end civil war. In 43 BC, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus formed a legally authorized triumvirate, officially charged with rebuilding the state. In reality, they wielded extraordinary power. They published new lists of public enemies, confiscated property, and hunted opponents. The great orator Cicero had supported Octavian against Antony, but he too was condemned. His head and hands are displayed on the speaker's platform. In 42 BC, the triumvirs defeated Brutus and Cassius at Philippi. The Roman world was then divided in broad terms. Antony controlled the east. Octavian held the west. Lepidus was gradually pushed aside. Antony formed both a political and romantic alliance with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Octavian launched a propaganda campaign portraying Antony as a man controlled by an Egyptian queen and corrupted away from Roman values. He avoided presenting the coming struggle as yet another Roman civil war. Instead, he declared that Rome was fighting Cleopatra. In 31 BC, the fleets met off the western coast of Greece at Actium. Octavian's commander Agrippa won the battle. The following year, Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives in Alexandria. Egypt became a Roman province. Octavian was now the sole master of the Roman world. The offices of the Republic still existed. The Senate remained. Citizen assemblies continued. Romans would not accept a man openly calling himself king. Octavian therefore faced a task more difficult than winning a civil war. He had to create a monarchy while persuading everyone that the Republic had been restored. In 27 BC, Octavian staged the return of his powers to the Senate. In gratitude, the senators gave him the title Augustus, carrying a sense of sacred dignity and majesty. He often described himself as princeps, the first citizen, rather than king. Later historians called the system he created the Principate. On the surface, consuls were still elected every year. The Senate administered some provinces. Laws continued to be issued in Republican language. In practice, Augustus retained long-term control of the most important provinces and most of the legions within them. He held supreme military command, tribunician authority, and unmatched prestige. He did not need a crown. The army, finances, appointments, and public story of the state all revolved around him. This was not merely a trick. After decades of civil war, aristocrats feared another purge. Ordinary people wanted food and safety. Provincial communities wanted governors who stole less. Soldiers wanted regular pay and reliable land or pensions at retirement. Augustus offered the most valuable commodity of all, predictability. He reduced the swollen armies of the Civil War period and created a more stable standing force with regular terms of service. Legions were stationed on the frontiers, and a military treasury was established to fund retirement payments. The Praetorian Guard protected the capital and the emperor, but would later become a dangerous force in imperial succession. The army did not contain the legendary 300 legions. Early in Augustus's reign, there were around 27 or 28. After the disaster in the Teutoburg forest, the number settled at roughly 25, supported by a large auxiliary force. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, is often described as 2 centuries of calm from Augustus to the era of the so-called Five Good Emperors. It did create a more stable environment for trade, cities, and movement across the Mediterranean core, which no longer saw wars repeatedly destroying entire states. But for frontier peoples, conquered communities, and rebels being crushed, this was not peace. It was the order that followed Roman victory. Augustus continued wars in Spain, the Alps, and the Balkans, pushing the frontiers toward the Rhine and Danube. Through diplomacy, he persuaded Parthia to return standards captured from Roman armies and presented the recovery as a major victory. In AD 9, the Germanic noble Arminius exploited Roman trust and ambushed the governor Varus in the Teutoburg forest. 3 legions were destroyed. Ancient writers claim that Augustus cried, "Varus, give me back my legions." The line may be literary, but it reflects the depth of the shock. Rome did not completely abandon all activity east of the Rhine, but plans for permanent conquest deep into Germania were broken. The Rhine to Danube frontier gradually became the northern frame of the empire. The defeat proved again that Rome was not invincible. The difference was that the empire could lose 3 legions without collapsing. That resilience came from the invisible routines behind the army. A recruit did not become the perfect soldier shown in statues the moment he swore the oath. He had to march long distances carrying heavy equipment, practice throwing the pilum, drill with the short sword, build camps, and learn the calls, commands, and harsh punishments of military life. The centurion was both trainer and the most immediate face of authority. A legion was not one simple type of infantry. It was a moving society of soldiers, cavalry, engineers, medical staff, surveyors, and transport crews. Before any battle, where the grain came from, how a river would be crossed, and how the wounded would be moved often mattered more than the elegance of a charge. Legionaries received pay, but deductions could be made for equipment and living costs. Service was long. In the early empire, formal marriage was restricted for soldiers, although many formed unofficial families near their bases. Shops, taverns, workshops, and settlements appeared beside forts. Soldiers wrote home asking for socks, food, or money. They complained about officers, weather, and boredom. Surviving wooden tablets remind us that the Roman army was not a machine without emotion. It was a collection of people far from home, held together by discipline. Alongside the legions stood large auxiliary forces recruited from provincial peoples without full citizenship. They supplied cavalry, archers, and specialized local skills. After completing service, auxiliaries generally received Roman citizenship. The army, therefore, became another road by which the empire absorbed populations. A young man born in a frontier village might serve on another continent, retire there as a Roman citizen, and raise children who spoke with mixed accents, worshipped several gods, and regarded the emperor, the standards, and Roman law as ordinary parts of life. The frontier was not simply a wall between 2 worlds. It was more like a river constantly pulling people into Rome. Augustus rebuilt or constructed temples, roads, forums, and public facilities. In the residential gesti, his record of achievements, he listed the money he spent, the soldiers he settled, and the honors he received. It was a carefully composed portrait of the man who saved the Republic. Virgil's Aeneid traced Rome's mission back to a Trojan hero. Livy's history told the story of Rome's growth through a tension between ancient virtue and contemporary anxiety. Art also served the new political order. Statues of Augustus usually showed him youthful, controlled, and almost timeless, not as an ordinary politician who would age and weaken. The Era Paces, the altar of peace, displayed the imperial family, ritual, and fertility, translating victory in civil war into the restoration of cosmic order. Augustus reformed the grain supply, firefighting, and urban administration of Rome. He improved supervision of provincial taxation and tried to restrain the worst forms of extortion by governors. Imperial administration was still small, and much depended on self-governing cities, local elites, and private contractors. Even so, central oversight was more stable than it had been in the late Republic. He also introduced marriage and morality laws, encouraging childbirth among the upper classes and punishing certain forms of adultery. He hoped to bind domestic order to state order, but he could not control his own family. Chosen heirs died or fell from favor. His daughter Julia was exiled after scandal. In the end, he had to choose his stepson Tiberius. The empire was not ruled by legions stationed in every village. It depended on a network of cities and local cooperation. Local elites collected taxes, funded public buildings, maintained order, and organized festivals. They traded personal wealth for public honor. They learned Latin or Greek, joined Roman citizenship, and in some cases entered the Senate. Roman law coexisted with local custom. The empire did not require everyone to speak one language or worship one set of gods. In the West, Latin and Roman urban forms spread increasingly widely. In the East, Greek remained the dominant language of cities and culture. Rome did not erase difference. It built a framework in which many differences could survive, provided all recognized the emperor's supreme authority. If you traveled across the empire after Augustus, you would discover that Rome did not mean every city looked the same. It meant familiar institutions and scenes kept reappearing in different places. At dawn, ships loaded with grain entered Ostia. Dock workers moved the cargo into warehouses, and the state organized its delivery to the capital. Aqueducts crossed the countryside, carrying distant spring water into fountains, baths, and wealthy homes. Most people still collected water from public sources. The poor lived in crowded apartment buildings and feared fire and collapse at night. The streets were not quiet like a modern city. Wheels, cellars, animals, and workshop hammers mixed together from morning to evening. In the afternoon, the baths became low-cost social palaces. People came not only to wash, but to exercise, make business deals, exchange rumors, and build relationships. Lawsuits filled the forum. Offerings were made at temples. Dicerolle in taverns. Amphitheaters and racecourses transformed violence and excitement into public festival. The emperor supplied grain and entertainment, not merely to flatter the crowd, but to persuade a capital of perhaps 1 million people that taxes from distant provinces had been turned into visible order. But we should not look only at marble. Every bath complex depended on people cutting fuel, feeding furnaces, carrying supplies, and cleaning. Every banquet depended on slaves moving through kitchens and corridors. Enslaved people did not share one fate. Some were chained in mines. Some taught children. Some accumulated money through skilled work and eventually became free. Freedmen who became wealthy could still be reminded of their origins by old aristocrats, but their children might rise higher. Roman society was cruel and mobile at the same time. The doors were not fully closed, but they were never equally open to everyone. Women could not serve as consuls or vote in citizen assemblies, but they did not exist only in hidden household rooms. Wealthy women could own and manage property, finance buildings, arrange marriages, and cultivate political relationships. Poorer women worked in shops, workshops, markets, and homes. Tombstones from across the empire preserve their lives as wives, mothers, daughters, business owners, slaves, and freed women. The real Rome belonged not only to Caesars and legions, but also to the people who kept life moving between hearths, account books, docks, and cemeteries. In the provinces, Roman identity was more like a layer of clothing that could be worn over other identities. A Gaul could worship local gods while erecting a statue of the emperor in the forum. An Egyptian priest could represent the emperor as a pharaoh. A Syrian merchant might speak Greek, follow local custom, and use Roman law for property. As long as taxes, order, and loyalty were maintained, the empire usually allowed identities to overlap. Its unity did not require everyone to become the same person. It required different people to learn a common language of power when dealing with the center. Augustus died in AD 14. The Senate declared him a god. Tradition says that near death, he asked whether he had performed the comedy of life well. Whether or not he spoke those exact words, he had completed one of history's most successful political performances. He ended the Republic and made Republican vocabulary the clothing of empire. But the system left one question without a formal answer. When the emperor died, who decided the next emperor? Blood, adoption, approval by the Senate, support from the army, and selection by the Praetorian Guard all seemed to count. None counted every time. Augustus created stability. He also built the stage for every future succession crisis. Tiberius inherited a monarchy that had never openly admitted it was a monarchy. He was an experienced soldier and a cautious manager of money. The early years of his rule were not disastrous, but he lacked Augustus's gift for presenting power as humility. He and the Senate distrusted one another. Senators did not know when the emperor was speaking sincerely, while the emperor regarded their flattery as dishonest. In the histories of Tacitus, Tiberius gradually becomes withdrawn and suspicious. He retired to the island of Capri and allowed the Praetorian prefect Sejanus to accumulate power. Sejanus removed enemies and built his own position, only to be suddenly arrested and executed on Tiberius's orders. Treason trials and informers created fear among the Roman elite. Yet these stories must be read carefully. Most surviving literary accounts were written by members of the senatorial class, who were especially sensitive to emperors who reduced the Senate's influence. Tiberius's reign included repression, but it also preserved frontier security and financial stability. Imperial history would repeatedly produce the same contrast. A ruler might mean predictable taxation and safe roads in the provinces, yet survive in aristocratic memory only as a monster. In AD 37, the young Gaius became emperor. Soldiers had nicknamed him Caligula, Little Boots, because as a child he wore miniature military footwear. At first, Rome welcomed him enthusiastically. He was the son of the beloved General Germanicus. Soon, the surviving accounts turned dark. Caligula insulted senators, spent recklessly, ordered cruel executions, presented himself as divine, and was even said to have planned to make his favorite horse a consul. That last story was probably satire, a way of saying that a horse was more fit to hold office than the senators themselves, rather than evidence of a completed appointment. Ancient writers used absurd anecdotes to express the complete collapse of relations between the emperor and the aristocracy. In AD 41, officers of the Praetorian Guard assassinated Caligula. The conspirators imagined that the Senate might restore the Republic. Instead, guards found Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding in the palace and proclaimed him emperor. Once again, armed men demonstrated that the final judge of succession was not always law, but force. Claudius had physical disabilities and a stammer. For most of his life, the imperial family considered him unfit for public affairs, which may have helped him survive repeated purges. As emperor, however, he showed a strong interest in administration. He expanded the imperial secretariat and relied on talented freedmen to manage finance, correspondence, and legal business. Senatorial aristocrats despised these slaves of the emperor, but a vast empire genuinely needed a more professional administration than the old republic had possessed. Claudius built harbor works and aqueducts, improved the grain supply, and encouraged provincial elites to enter Roman political life. In AD 48, he supported the admission of leading men from Gaul into the Senate. His argument was deeply Roman. Rome had always grown by absorbing outsiders. In AD 43, Rome invaded Britain. The conquest was incomplete and would require repeated fighting, but the empire acquired new province. Claudius traveled there to receive the formal submission and transformed military success into imperial prestige. His private life became a treasury of scandal. His wife Messalina was accused of publicly marrying another man and plotting to seize power, and she was executed. Claudius later married his niece Agrippina the Younger and adopted Nero, her son from an earlier marriage. Claudius died in AD 54. Ancient tradition claimed that he ate poisoned mushrooms prepared through Agrippina's conspiracy. Murder cannot be proven, but Nero succeeded him immediately. Nero was 16 years old. In the early years, the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus guided the government, which remained relatively restrained. As Nero secured power, he clashed with his mother and eventually arranged her murder. Ancient narratives describe the killing like a dark drama. First, a specially built ship was made to collapse, and when Agrippina survived, assassins were sent. The details may have been shaped by literary storytelling, but the rupture between mother and son and Agrippina's death are historical facts. In AD 64, a great fire destroyed large parts of Rome. Later generations repeatedly embellished the story that Nero played music while the city burned. More reliable evidence suggests that he participated in relief and reconstruction. Yet he also used land cleared by the fire to build the enormous Golden House, increasing suspicion. To redirect blame, the authorities punished a number of Christians with extreme cruelty. This is one of the earliest clearly recorded persecutions of Christians in the city of Rome. Nero loved singing, poetry, chariot racing, and public performance. Modern audiences might consider an emperor taking the stage charming or approachable. Roman aristocrats viewed it as a humiliation of imperial dignity. Financial demands, executions, and court conspiracies steadily increased resentment. In AD 68, legions in Gaul and Spain rebelled. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. He fled and killed himself, reportedly saying, "What an artist dies in me." The phrase may also be polished literature, but it perfectly fits the way he wished to imagine himself. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was over. More importantly, the legitimacy inherited from Augustus's family had been exhausted. From this point onward, any man with sufficient military support could claim to be emperor. In AD 69, for emperors ruled in succession: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. Armies in Spain, on the Rhine, and in the east supported different candidates. The fighting moved from the provinces into Italy itself. The final winner, Vespasian, did not come from the highest aristocracy. He was an experienced commander who had been leading the war in Judea. After the eastern legions proclaimed him, his supporters defeated Vitellius. Fighting entered the streets of Rome. The temple on the Capitoline Hill burned. The capital of the empire was once more captured by Roman troops. Vespasian founded the Flavian dynasty. Through financial discipline, practical administration, and military authority, he restored order. He began construction of the amphitheater later called the Colosseum, on land formerly occupied by part of Nero's Golden House. The symbolism was brilliant. Space used for a private palace was returned to the people, while large-scale entertainment strengthened the new dynasty. The amphitheater became one of Rome's most famous faces. Spectators entered according to rank. The emperor, senators, equestrians, ordinary men, and women occupied different areas. The seating arrangement itself was a map of social hierarchy. Gladiators included slaves, prisoners of war, and free volunteers under contract. They did not necessarily die in every match because training a skilled fighter was expensive, but death was always part of the attraction. Wild animals arrived from North Africa and the Near East. The empire transformed its ability to conquer the world into visual spectacle. The crowd shouted, gambled, admired celebrity gladiators, and expressed approval or anger toward the emperor. The ruler sat in the center of the city's gaze, both the master who gave entertainment and the performer being judged by the public. Roman politics did not take place only in the Senate. Racecourses, baths, theaters, and arenas were also places where people experienced the state. Vespasian's son Titus had already captured Jerusalem in AD 70. The Second Temple was destroyed, with profound consequences for Jewish society and religion. During Titus's short reign, Mount Vesuvius erupted in AD 79, burying Pompeii and Herculaneum. Rome also suffered fire and epidemic. Titus died after only a brief rule and was succeeded by his brother Domitian. The cities buried by Vesuvius later preserved an accidental still image of Roman life. Pompeii had bakeries, taverns, election slogans, graffiti, and garden courtyards. Its walls carried both mythological paintings and vulgar jokes. Some people gathered coins as the disaster began. Some hid indoors. Others tried to escape along the roads. The volcano did not preserve a Rome made only of aristocrats and statues. It preserved ovens, millstones, doorways, and writing on walls. Imperial history suddenly gained human warmth. The people living in that supposed golden age did not know they would become witnesses for the distant future. They were simply baking bread, making deals, and competing in elections on an ordinary day. Domitian strengthened frontier defense, improved administration, and paid close attention to military salaries. He also placed increasing emphasis on imperial majesty and became deeply hostile to the Senate. In AD 96, he was murdered in a palace conspiracy. The Senate condemned his memory, but many soldiers resented his death. After Domitian, the elderly senator Nerva was made emperor. He lacked military support, so he adopted Trajan, a commander respected by the legions, as his heir. This opened the period later celebrated as rule by the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. The traditional story says they did not pass power to biological sons, but adopted the most capable successor. There was wisdom in this arrangement, but also chance. Most of the first four emperors simply had no surviving biological son available for succession. Adoption of the best man was never a written constitutional rule. Even so, the long sequence of relatively orderly successions reduced civil war and allowed the empire to reach its height in the 2nd century. Trajan was the first emperor born outside Italy, in a senatorial family from the province of Hispania. That fact alone showed that the Roman elite was no longer confined to the city of Rome. Trajan conquered Dacia in 2 major wars, gaining mines, land, and treasure. His column in Rome presented the campaigns as a continuous spiral of carved images. He later invaded the Parthian East, occupying Armenia and parts of Mesopotamia. Around AD 117, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from Britain to the Near East and from the Rhine and Danube to North Africa. The largest empire on a map is not always the most governable. Trajan's eastern conquests were difficult to hold. His successor Hadrian abandoned part of the expansion and concentrated on strengthening the frontiers. He traveled widely through the provinces, inspected troops, and built or reinforced defensive systems. Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain became the most famous symbol of the policy. Hadrian was not simply a peaceful emperor. From AD 132 to 135, the Bar Kokhba revolt broke out in Judea. Rome suppressed it only after a difficult war that caused catastrophic loss of life and social destruction. Jerusalem was rebuilt as a Roman colony, and Jewish access and settlement were severely restricted. The brightness of imperial order always existed alongside the disasters suffered by those it defeated. Antoninus Pius ruled for more than 20 years with few large wars. Later generations remembered his reign as a high point of the Roman peace. Provincial cities flourished. Trade connected British tin, Spanish silver, Egyptian grain, Syrian caravan routes, and North African olive oil. Red Sea and Indian Ocean commerce linked the Roman world to Arabia, India, and regions beyond. Chinese records preserve vague references to envoys or merchants from the direction of a place they called the Qin, the Great Qin, their name for Rome. A product traveling from one end of the empire to the other passed through many hands. North African olive oil was sealed into amphorae and shipped to Rome. Egyptian grain moved down the Nile and across the Mediterranean. Spanish metals, Syrian glass, textiles from Asia Minor, and spices from the Indian Ocean reached imperial ports. Storms, shipwrecks, pirates, tolls, and taxes never disappeared. Rome did not create a market without risk. It lowered uncertainty through shared currency, common legal habits, harbor infrastructure, and comparatively secure sea routes. The frontier was not a thin line drawn on a map. It was a region where people lived. Settlements grew beside forts, filled with traders, soldiers' families, craftspeople, and veterans. Auxiliary soldiers might come from the Balkans, Syria, or North Africa and serve far from home. At the end of service, they could receive citizenship. They carried local gods, food, and languages to their posts, then brought Roman military habits back to their home regions. The empire was like a constantly stirred pot. The legions guarded the borders while unintentionally carrying cultures from place to place. Religion was equally varied. Traditional gods, local deities, emperor worship, Judaism, Christianity, and mystery cults from the East all existed side by side. People could pray to different gods for different needs. Soldiers were especially drawn to rituals that offered group identity. Rome usually did not ask what one person believed exclusively in the heart. It cared more about whether public sacrifice expressed loyalty to the community. That is why Jews and Christians insisted on one God and sometimes refused public offerings could be regarded at particular moments as incomprehensible or dangerous. The imperial economy was not a modern unified market. Transportation remained expensive. Local conditions differed greatly. Agriculture was still the foundation of life. Hunger and poverty did not disappear. Enslaved labor supported much production and domestic work, and the violence of mines, estates, and markets remained the hidden side of prosperity. In AD 161, Marcus Aurelius became emperor and made Lucius Verus his co-ruler. Joint rule reflected the growing scale of imperial affairs. After war in the East, returning troops carried a devastating epidemic, usually called the Antonine Plague. Its exact pathogen remains uncertain, though smallpox is a common suggestion. It returned in waves across the empire, reducing population, tax revenue, and military strength. At the same time, the Marcomanni and other peoples crossed the Danube frontier. Marcus spent years with the army in the north. In cold military camps, he wrote the private reflections later known as the Meditations. He reminded himself to control anger, accept fate, and perform his duty. Later generations made him the model of the philosopher-emperor. Yet philosophy could not remove political contradictions. His reign still included persecution, war, and harsh order. More important for the future, Marcus allowed his biological son Commodus to succeed him, ending the fortunate chain of adopted heirs. Marcus died in AD 180. Films and popular stories often treat that year as the beginning of Roman decline, as though a wise ruler closed his eyes and the empire immediately entered darkness. Real history was not that neat. Rome would survive for centuries, and the Eastern Empire for more than 1,000 years. Yet the favorable conditions of the 2nd century, comparatively stable succession, manageable frontiers, strong tax revenues, and relatively few massive epidemic shocks were beginning to disappear. The Golden Age had not discovered an eternal formula. It was a period in which many dangers simply had not erupted at the same time. Commodus became emperor while still young and quickly departed from his father's style of rule. He brought some frontier wars to an end, relied more heavily on palace favorites and the Praetorian Guard, presented himself as a new Hercules, and personally appeared in arena performances. Ancient writers describe him shooting animals under carefully controlled conditions and fighting gladiators before demanding enormous payments from the treasury. To ordinary spectators, it may have been thrilling. To senatorial aristocrats, it degraded the dignity of the emperor into professional entertainment, while combining theatrical divinity with real political violence. At the end of AD 192, Commodus was strangled in a palace conspiracy. The assassins failed to create a stable succession. Instead, they opened the way for the imperial throne to be sold. In AD 193, the elderly Pertinax attempted to restore discipline and was killed by the Praetorian Guard after only a few months. The guards then offered the empire to the highest bidder. Didius Julianus promised the greatest reward. The Roman world was stunned. The supreme authority Augustus had wrapped in sacred dignity now looked like an object at auction. The frontier armies refused to accept it. The legions of Pannonia proclaimed Septimius Severus, who marched rapidly into Rome, executed Julianus, and then defeated his other rivals. Severus came from Leptis Magna in North Africa. His wife, Julia Domna, belonged to a Syrian priestly family. The imperial household itself now displayed the multinational character of the Roman world. Severus increased military pay, rewarded the troops, permitted more settled family life around the army, and relied on the soldiers to secure his dynasty. Ancient tradition says he advised his sons to enrich the soldiers and ignore everyone else. The wording may be simplified, but it captures an important shift. Emperors increasingly had to purchase loyalty directly through military spending. His sons Caracalla and Geta inherited the empire together and hated one another. Caracalla had Geta murdered in their mother's presence and then purged his supporters. In AD 212, he issued the Constitutio Annunniana, granting Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. It was a historic change. Roman citizenship had once been scarce and had expanded in carefully graded layers. Now it covered almost the entire empire. The motives may have included legal standardization, the extension of taxes that applied to citizens, and the desire to present citizenship as an imperial gift. The result was that Roman no longer meant primarily a person from Italy or a privileged city. It became an empire-wide political identity. Citizenship mattered not merely because it sounded honorable. It affected lawful marriage, inheritance, property transfer, court procedure, and certain punishments. When auxiliary soldiers received bronze citizenship certificates after completing service, the tablets were not just rewards. They documented a transformation in the legal identity of entire families. Local elites sought citizenship because it opened access to a larger political and commercial world. Emperors expanded citizenship because it brought more people under direct imperial law and taxation. Yet the decree of AD 212 did not make all free people equal. Senators, equestrians, municipal elites, ordinary free people, freedmen, and slaves remained separated by enormous differences. The law itself could punish people of higher and lower status differently. A person might simultaneously be a Roman citizen, a resident of a particular city, a member of a trade association, and a participant in a local linguistic and religious community. Citizenship was a broad net cast over the empire. It did not cut away every older relationship beneath it. This also shows that Romanization was never a one-way current flowing from the capital to the provinces. Provincial peoples adopted Roman law and urban institutions, but the center absorbed provincial gods, foods, clothing, soldiers, women, and rulers. An emperor from North Africa could command Rome. Syrian women could stand at the center of court politics. Soldiers from the Danube could rebuild a collapsing state. By this point, the question, who is a pure Roman, had become nearly impossible to answer. Rome was not an unchanging ethnic label. It was an expanding political status and an identity constantly being reinterpreted. Because that identity had grown so wide, the kingdoms that replaced Western imperial rule would not simply discard it. They would compete to prove that they were still continuing Roman order. Caracalla was later assassinated in an eastern military camp. The Severan dynasty struggled through palace coups, short reigns, and growing pressure on the frontiers. It finally ended in AD 235. From AD 235 to 284, Rome entered the period called the Crisis of the 3rd century, or the Age of the Soldier Emperors. Over several decades, numerous emperors and rival claimants were raised by armies. Many died in battle, assassination, or mutiny. The problem was not simply that too many emperors were bad. The empire faced multiple pressures at the same time. In the east, the new Sasanian Persian Empire replaced the Parthians. It was more centralized, more aggressive, and more capable of sustained conflict over Armenia and Mesopotamia. In the north, Goths, Franks, Alemanni, and other groups crossed or attacked the frontiers. Internally, the army had to grow. Pay and bonuses rose. Civil war repeatedly consumed forces that should have been defending the borders. To meet expenses, emperors repeatedly reduced the silver content of the currency. Debasement, price instability, and rising demands for taxation and requisition increased economic anxiety. The so-called plague of Cyprian spread through many regions in the middle of the 3rd century, adding pressure to population and organization. The damage differed greatly from one province to another, and trade and production did not simply cease. But expectations of stability were badly shaken. For ordinary people, the 3rd century crisis was not a list of short-lived emperors in a textbook. It meant that a coin used today might contain less silver tomorrow. A road that had been safe last year might now be crossed by deserters and raiders. After one army took grain, another commander claiming to be emperor might arrive and demand more. Frontier cities repaired walls. Wealthy families buried valuables. Villagers sought protection from large landowners or local armed groups. When epidemic passed through, labor forces, tax registers, and recruitment lists all developed gaps at the same time. The emperor's portrait continued to be stamped on coins, but the emperor himself might be killed before the image wore smooth. Every frontier army had reason to believe that its commander understood the crisis better than anyone else. Every proclamation of a new emperor forced other armies to choose between obedience and war. At the moment the empire most needed unified command, military power repeatedly created new centers of command. Rome had not suddenly forgotten how to govern. Every solution produced another problem. Higher military pay could stabilize soldiers, but burdened the treasury. Debased currency could meet immediate payments, but damaged trust. Pulling troops from a frontier might win a civil war, but expose the border to enemies. In AD 251, Emperor Decius died fighting the Goths. In AD 260, Emperor Valerian was captured by the Sasanian king Shapur I. It was one of the most humiliating events in Roman history. Persian reliefs showed Shapur as the victor, with the Roman emperor kneeling or held under his control. In the same period, the empire nearly split into 3 parts. In the west, a breakaway Gallic empire controlled Gaul, Britain, and for a time Spain. In the east, Palmyra under Odenathus, and then Queen Zenobia developed into an independent power. The central emperor controlled only Italy, the Balkans, and scattered regions. If the Roman story had ended there, it would have seemed entirely reasonable. After Valerian's capture, his son Gallienus ruled alone. He faced rival emperors, foreign invasions, and epidemic. Ancient senatorial authors often treated him with contempt, but modern historians give greater attention to his military changes. He relied more heavily on equestrian and professional officers and developed mobile forces capable of responding to several frontiers at once. A group of soldier emperors from the Danube region then began to stabilize the situation. Claudius II defeated a major Gothic force, but died of disease. Aurelian became emperor in AD 270 and, in only a few years, achieved what had seemed impossible. He defeated invaders, withdrew from the part of Dacia that could no longer be defended, and surrounded the city of Rome with a new line of walls. Then he marched east, defeated Palmyra, and captured Zenobia. Turning west, he brought the Gallic Empire back under central rule. His coins called him Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. Aurelian did not die in a great battle. While preparing a campaign against Persia, he was assassinated by his own officers. According to one story, a corrupt official forged a list of men supposedly marked for punishment, convincing the officers that the emperor planned to kill them. The ending was perfectly characteristic of the 3rd century. A man could restore the empire and still fail to create political trust within his own command. Probus and other successors continued to repair the frontiers, but many were also killed in mutinies. In AD 284, an officer named Diocletian was proclaimed emperor. Unlike many predecessors, he intended not only to defeat rivals, but to rebuild the structure of the state. The 3rd century crisis had proved Rome's extraordinary resilience, but also exposed the limits of the Principate. The subtle Augustan fiction that the emperor was only the first among citizens could no longer manage an empire facing permanent war on multiple fronts and a state whose finances were increasingly organized around the military. The next reforms would end the pretense. The emperor would become an openly sacred monarch, distant from ordinary subjects, wearing jewels and receiving ceremonial submission. After defeating his rivals, Diocletian accepted the clearest lesson of the 3rd century. The empire was too large and crises were too numerous for one emperor and one capital to hurry from frontier to frontier. In AD 286, he appointed Maximian as a 2nd Augustus. In AD 293, each Augustus received a junior emperor called Caesar. This created the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. Diocletian governed the east. Maximian held the west. Galerius and Constantius Chlorus served as subordinate rulers, designated successors, and regional commanders. The Tetrarchy was not meant to divide Rome permanently into 4 countries. It was a system of shared empire, regional defense, and planned succession. The emperors lived near frontiers and major transport routes in cities such as Nicomedia, Milan, and Trier. Rome retained enormous symbolic importance, but real political centers had spread elsewhere. Diocletian divided provinces into smaller units and created additional administrative layers. He strengthened systems of tax assessment and more clearly separated some civilian and military responsibilities. He expanded the army and bureaucracy and relied on a mixture of payments in money and in kind, allowing the state to predict military supplies more effectively. The system improved mobilization but placed heavy burdens on society. To preserve tax revenue and ensure that essential occupations continued, the government increasingly tied farmers, craftspeople, and municipal councilors to inherited responsibilities. The later empire did not suddenly become a perfectly rigid caste society, but the state did intervene more deeply in land, labor, and occupation. In AD 301, Diocletian issued the edict on maximum prices, attempting to control wages and the prices of a vast range of goods. The law could not overcome regional differences, supply and demand, and currency instability. Enforcement was limited. The edict reads like an inventory of anxiety left behind by the 3rd century crisis. The state understood that the economy was unstable, but reality could not be ordered back into balance by an inscription carved in stone. What Diocletian truly changed was the way the state counted land and people. Officials assessed fields, crops, animals, and labor more systematically and connected the tax burden to the needs of the army. For the central government, this made grain, clothing, horses, and transport more predictable. For villages, it meant more frequent registration, more difficult obligations, and municipal councilors forced to cover unpaid taxes from their own resources. The late empire was not simply a story of administrative decline. In many ways, it had a more complex state than before. But that state felt increasingly like a tightening hand, supporting the empire while also placing greater pressure on society. Tetrarchic propaganda showed the four emperors with almost identical faces, embracing one another. The image insisted that they were not competitors, but four bodies of a single order. Reality proved otherwise. Statues could embrace. The armies of successors could not. After Diocletian retired to his palace and gardens, the carefully designed system was torn apart by bloodlines, military reputation, and force. Rome discovered again that the most difficult frontier was never the Rhine or the Euphrates. It was the moment after an emperor died. Traditional Roman religion was not a single book of doctrine. It was a collection of sacrifices, temples, household rites, and acts of public loyalty. The empire usually tolerated different gods, as long as local worship did not challenge public order. Christians refused to sacrifice to traditional deities and to sacred images of the emperor, so in periods of crisis, they could be accused of rejecting their obligations to the community. Christianity had spread through urban networks since the 1st century, attracting people of different social levels. It emphasized one God, salvation, community, and charity. Networks of bishops gradually connected cities. Persecution was not constant for 300 years. Local attacks and empire-wide campaigns occurred at different times. In AD 303, Diocletian's government launched the last and most systematic great persecution in Roman history. Churches were destroyed. Scriptures were burned. Christians were ordered to sacrifice. The intensity varied greatly by region. The persecution did not destroy Christianity. Instead, it created a powerful memory of martyrs and strengthened group identity. Christianity did not spread mainly through an organized missionary army. It moved through dense relationships between cities. Merchants, artisans, women, slaves, freed people, and some wealthy households met in private homes to pray, read letters, and share meals. Greek was widely understood in eastern cities. Roman roads and sea routes carried people and texts from province to province. When a small congregation suffered, another might send money. When someone was ill, imprisoned, or bereaved, the community could provide care. In a sharply hierarchical world, this kind of belonging beyond the family could be deeply attractive. The movement also grew through argument. Churches in different cities did not begin with complete agreement about doctrine, ritual, or the limits of Scripture. The authority of bishops strengthened as they settled disputes, managed property, and represented communities during persecution. Roman officials sometimes treated Christians as strange but tolerable, and at other times demanded public sacrifice from everyone as a test of loyalty. Some believers chose martyrdom. Some fled. Some surrendered books or performed sacrifice. When persecution ended, churches fought bitterly over whether these people could return. Constantine's later support for Christianity, therefore, did not transform a tiny secret sect into a major religion overnight. It recognized a movement that already possessed urban networks, property, leaders, and public influence. The emperor gave the church resources on a scale it had never known. The church gave imperial power a new language of legitimacy. Once the two were joined, faith was no longer only about personal salvation. It became connected to law, office, urban conflict, and imperial unity. Bishops once hunted by officials began attending councils summoned by emperors. A religion that had refused sacrifice before imperial images gradually learned to pray for imperial victory. In AD 305, Diocletian and Maximian retired together. Voluntary retirement was almost unknown among Roman emperors and showed that Diocletian genuinely hoped the Tetrarchy would preserve an orderly succession. The system quickly broke apart under the pressure of imperial sons, rival armies, and regional interests. The architect could leave the stage. Ambition could not. Constantius died in Britain in AD 306. His army immediately proclaimed his son Constantine. The planned order of succession collapsed, and several emperors entered a long period of civil war. In AD 312, Constantine defeated Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge near Rome. Christian writers later said that before the battle he saw a cross or the symbol of Christ in the sky and received the message, "By this conquer." The surviving versions were written at different times and contained different details. Historians cannot verify a vision as they would verify a military order. But Constantine did increasingly support Christianity in public after the victory. In AD 313, Constantine and the Eastern Emperor Licinius confirmed religious toleration and ordered the return of confiscated Christian property. The agreement is commonly known as the Edict of Milan. It did not immediately make Christianity the official state religion. It ended official persecution and granted the church legal recognition and favor. Constantine and Licinius eventually turned against one another. In AD 324, Constantine defeated his final rival and reunited the empire. The following year, he summoned the Council of Nicaea to address disputes over the nature of Christ. The emperor did not simply accept a church that was already perfectly united. He began using state authority to encourage religious unity. In return, bishops and doctrine became important forces in imperial politics. In AD 330, Constantine dedicated a new capital built on the old site of Byzantium. It became Constantinople and was also called New Rome. The city controlled the Bosporus, the passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It stood close to the wealthy eastern provinces and to the Danube and Persian frontiers. Surrounded by water on three sides, it was exceptionally defensible. This decision changed world history. Rome was no longer the empire's only center. The Eastern Roman Empire had gained a political heart that would beat for more than 1,000 years. The new capital was more than a change of address. Constantine built palaces, forums, a great racecourse, and churches. He brought statues from across the empire and gave the city grain distributions and special privileges modeled on Old Rome. Part of the old capital's memory was transplanted and stitched to a Christian future. Here, chariot racing was not merely sport. The blues and greens gained passionate followings. The hippodrome stood beside the palace, so the cheers and insults of the crowd could reach the emperor directly. Bishops, court officials, soldiers, merchants, and foreign envoys lived inside the walls. The empire increasingly spoke Greek and increasingly explained power through Christianity, but it still considered itself Roman. It did not abandon its soul. It taught that soul a new language. Constantine reformed the gold currency and established the stable solidus, which became the foundation of high-value Mediterranean money for centuries. He continued to develop central and regional administration. He reorganized the army, combining mobile field forces with frontier troops. The late Roman military was no longer composed only of the large, fixed legions familiar from the early empire. It contained units of different sizes and purposes. The image of the emperor also changed. In the Principate, the ruler had at least spoken the language of a first citizen. Now court ceremony stressed divine favor, hierarchy, and distance between ruler and subject. Christianity gradually gave imperial power a new cosmic meaning, although traditional worship continued for a long time. Constantine himself was baptized only near death. This was not unusual in the period, when some believed that late baptism could wash away the sins of an entire life. After Constantine died, his sons fought for the empire and carried out purges within the imperial family. Christian emperors did not end Roman civil war, and theological unity did not end religious controversy. One later emperor, Julian, attempted to revive traditional religion. He died during a Persian campaign in AD 363. In AD 376, a large group of Goths, driven toward the frontier by the pressure of the Huns, asked permission to cross the Danube and enter the empire. Rome allowed them in, but corruption, abuse, and starvation followed during their settlement. The Goths rebelled. In AD 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Eastern Emperor Valens attacked before fully joining the expected reinforcements. The Roman army was crushed, and the emperor was killed. This was not a simple military revolution in which cavalry destroyed the legion once and for all. It was a political warning. The empire needed frontier populations and soldiers, yet could not guarantee that officials would manage their arrival without corruption. It is worth pausing beside the Danube. The Goths entering the empire were not simply an invading army carrying weapons. They included women, children, elderly people, and livestock, a displaced population driven to the river by the Huns. Rome could have settled them as farmers and recruited them as soldiers. It had done similar things many times before. But local officials withheld food, demanded bribes, and, according to one notorious story, exchanged dog meat for the children of starving families. People who had surrendered their weapons were still abused. In the end, those trying to survive picked up whatever blades they could find. Adrianople was therefore not a simple picture of civilization defeated by barbarians. It was an administrative disaster exploding on a battlefield. Rome had once grown by absorbing strangers. This time, it turned people willing to enter the system into enemies, then lost an emperor in a hurried battle. The empire would continue to recruit Gothic soldiers and generals, but trust had become much more expensive. Theodosius I took control in the east and eventually reached an agreement with the Goths, allowing them to settle as a group inside the empire in exchange for military service. Rome had used allied troops, or foederati, before, but the presence of large armed communities retaining their own leadership within imperial territory created increasingly complicated problems. In AD 380, Theodosius issued an edict supporting Nicene Christianity as the empire's Orthodox faith. Traditional sacrifice faced growing restrictions, and Christianity moved from persecuted religion to the center of imperial power. The change was not completed in a single night. Local pagan traditions continued for generations, while Christian factions continued to disagree among themselves. Theodosius briefly reunited East and West through civil war. When he died in AD 395, rule passed to his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. The empire had often been governed by several emperors in different regions, so the year 395 did not appear to contemporaries as a formal ceremony dividing one country into two. Legally, there was still one Roman world. The two courts even issued laws in the names of both emperors. But from this point onward, no emperor would again exercise effective long-term rule over both halves. The East possessed richer and more urbanized provinces, together with the defenses and financial strength of Constantinople. The West faced long frontiers on the Rhine and Danube, a weaker tax base, shifting political capitals, and armies increasingly dependent on powerful generals and foreign armed groups. The same storm was approaching both halves. The East would be shaken. The West would begin to come apart. After Theodosius's death, Honorius was still a child, and the real military power in the West belonged to the general Stilicho. Stilicho's father may have been a Vandal, but Stilicho himself grew up within the Roman army and imperial court and married a niece of Theodosius. Was he Roman or barbarian? By the late Empire, the question itself had become outdated. Roman armies had absorbed frontier peoples for centuries, and many so-called barbarian generals held Roman rank, spoke the language of imperial government, and served under the authority of emperors. The Gothic leader Alaric did not begin with a dream of destroying Rome. He had fought for the empire and wanted an official military command, land, and reliable supplies. His followers included warriors, families, and dependents. They needed a durable place inside the political order. Yet the Eastern and Western courts repeatedly treated him as a temporary tool. They made promises when they needed him, delayed them when they did not, and sometimes tried to direct him against the other half of the empire. In AD 401, Alaric entered Italy. Stilicho blocked him several times, but could not permanently solve the problem. The Western court moved its capital to Ravenna. Protected by marshland and access to the sea, Ravenna was safer than Rome. It also symbolized a new reality. The emperor had withdrawn from the traditional political center into a fortress that was difficult to attack. At the end of AD 406, the Rhine frontier suffered a major breach. Vandals, Alans, Suebi, and other groups entered Gaul. The West's limited forces were scattered even further. The army in Britain proclaimed its own emperor and crossed into Gaul. Central Roman control over Britain soon ended, leaving local communities to defend themselves. At the moment the West most needed Stilicho, the court destroyed him out of suspicion. In AD 408, Honorius approved his execution. Families of many soldiers of foreign origin were attacked, and survivors joined Alaric. The Western Empire had handed its own general and manpower to its enemy. Alaric surrounded Rome and demanded grain, money, military office, and a secure settlement. Negotiations repeatedly failed. In August of AD 410, the Goths entered Rome and plundered it for 3 days. For 800 years, the city had not been captured by a foreign army. The imperial capital had long since moved elsewhere, but the fall of the Eternal City created a profound psychological shock. Christians and defenders of traditional religion argued over its meaning. Some said the abandonment of the old gods had brought punishment. Augustine answered in the City of God that no earthly empire could ever be eternal. Alaric died soon afterward in southern Italy. His successors led the Visigoths into Gaul, where they eventually received land in the name of the empire and gradually built their own kingdom. A people who had first demanded a place within the Roman army ended by taking possession of Roman territory. The decisive weakness of the Western Empire was not one captured city. It was the continuing collapse of the cycle connecting taxation, land, and military defense. The state needed taxes to pay armies. Armies were needed to protect taxable land. Security allowed production and taxation to continue. When a wealthy region was lost, central revenue declined. With less revenue, the government could hire and supply fewer soldiers. With fewer soldiers, more regions were lost. Under the combined pressure of war, plunder, and competing demands, local people fled, avoided taxes, or attached themselves to powerful regional patrons. The tax base shrank again. Imagine the choices facing a landowner in Gaul. Imperial tax collectors demand grain because the army must defend the frontier. A passing army directly requisitions horses and supplies because the official grain has not arrived. A newly established armed group promises to protect the village from another army if the landowner recognizes its leader. He may not have suddenly stopped thinking of himself as Roman. He simply has to decide, before nightfall, who will receive the keys to his granary. Through countless practical choices like this, loyalty shifted from distant emperors toward people who could provide immediate protection. The central government was not merely losing areas on a map. It was losing the confidence of taxpayers. As long as imperial rule maintained roads, security, and courts, people had reasons to remain in the system even while complaining about taxes. When government continued to collect but could no longer protect, tax evasion, dependence on local strongmen, and regional autonomy became strategies of survival. The state did not disappear because it was locked outside one city gate. It vanished from tax registers that became less accurate every year. The western provinces lacked the dense cities and wealth of the east. Once important tax regions in Gaul, Spain, and North Africa slipped away, Italy alone could not support an army on an imperial scale. At the same time, Western emperors were often controlled by powerful generals. Those generals had to fight foreign enemies and also guard against rivals at court. Emperors feared usurpation and sometimes destroyed their most competent commanders before those commanders could turn against them. Civil war was especially destructive. An external enemy might seize one district. In a civil war, both sides used Rome's best troops, competed for tax regions, promised rewards, and purged the defeated after victory. Many barbarian invasions succeeded not because the frontiers had become completely empty, but because Roman armies were busy fighting one another over the throne. The Vandals who entered Gaul later crossed Spain and, in AD 429, moved into North Africa. Their leader Gaiseric was skilled at exploiting Roman divisions. In AD 439, Vandal forces suddenly captured Carthage. The loss was more damaging in practical terms than the sack of Rome in 410. North Africa was one of the richest and most stable tax regions in the West, and an important supplier of grain and olive oil to Italy. Carthage also provided ports and a fleet. Once the Vandal kingdom controlled naval power, it could raid Mediterranean islands and the Italian coast. The Western Empire attempted several times to recover Africa, but lacked sustained resources. The Eastern Empire sometimes helped, and at other times was distracted by its own wars and court politics. The West now resembled a company that had lost its main source of income, but continued to maintain an emperor, a senate, offices, and titles while becoming less able to pay the cost of those names. The Huns entered the European steppe world in the late 4th century. Their expansion pushed other peoples toward the Roman frontier. By the middle of the 5th century, Attila had created a large military coalition. He demanded tribute from the Eastern Empire and repeatedly attacked the Balkans. The Hunnic Empire was not a mindless wave of destruction. Attila conducted diplomacy, used Roman defectors, demanded gold, and controlled subject peoples. He understood the weaknesses of both Eastern and Western courts. Romans feared the Huns, negotiated with the Huns, and also hired Huns to fight in Roman wars. The most capable Western commander was Aetius. As a young man, he had lived among the Huns. Later, he used Hunnic allies during struggles for power within the West. In AD 451, Attila entered Gaul. Aetius built a coalition that included the Visigothic kingdom and other groups. The two alliances met in the region remembered as the Catalonian Plains. The battle is sometimes presented as Rome saving Western civilization. In reality, both armies were multi-ethnic coalitions, and the Huns were not destroyed. Attila withdrew and invaded Italy the following year. Hunger, disease, supply problems, and pressure from the Eastern Empire all shaped his decision to retreat. Pope Leo I met him, and later art portrayed the Pope driving back the barbarian king through spiritual authority. The historical retreat was probably the result of many practical factors. Attila died suddenly in AD 453. His coalition quickly broke apart under succession disputes and revolt by subject peoples. The greatest external threat disappeared, but the Western Empire did not recover. Aetius had dominated Western military affairs for years. Emperor Valentinian III feared his power. In AD 454, the emperor personally participated in killing him at court. Someone was later said to have told Valentinian, "You have cut off your right hand with your left." The following year, former followers of Aetius assassinated Valentinian. The dynasty ended, and the Western court fell into confusion. Gaiseric, king of the Vandals, used the violation of a marriage agreement as justification to attack Italy. In AD 455, the Vandals entered Rome and plundered the city for roughly 2 weeks. The word vandalism later came to mean the senseless destruction of culture, but the Vandals in 455 did not indiscriminately burn everything. Pope Leo negotiated with them, and the city may have avoided large-scale massacre and fire. Nevertheless, wealth, aristocratic hostages, and many captives were carried away. The damage was severe. Only 45 years separated the two sacks of Rome. The first had shocked the world. By the second, people were beginning to accept the impossible as something that could happen again. During the later 5th century, Western emperors changed rapidly. The general Ricimer, who had Suevic ancestry, could not easily claim the imperial title himself. Instead, he installed and removed several emperors. He represented the real structure of late Western power. The emperor supplied a legal name, while the military strongman controlled the state. Majorian was one of the few Western emperors who attempted a serious recovery. He reformed law, tried to reduce corruption, protected the tax base, and prepared a great expedition to reconquer North Africa. In AD 460, the fleet assembled in Spain was destroyed or captured by the Vandals. After losing his opportunity, Majorian was deposed and killed by Ricimer. In AD 468, the Eastern and Western empires launched an even larger expedition against North Africa. The fleet and army consumed immense resources. Near Cape Bon, Gaiseric used fire ships and naval tactics to destroy the expedition. The failure cost not only lives. It burned away the last realistic Western capacity for a large counterattack and badly damaged Eastern finances as well. After that, Western emperors often controlled little more than Italy and scattered parts of Gaul. A Roman military regime survived in northern Gaul. Dalmatia remained under the former emperor Julius Nepos. The empire on the map had become a collection of disconnected fragments. In AD 474, the Eastern emperor supported Julius Nepos as Western emperor. The following year, the military commander Orestes rebelled. Nepos fled to Dalmatia. Orestes did not take the imperial title himself. He placed his young son Romulus on the throne. The boy's official name was Romulus Augustus. Later writers called him Augustulus, the little Augustus. His father held the real power. Many soldiers stationed in Italy were of Germanic origin and demanded land in Italy as payment. Orestes refused. The soldiers then proclaimed Odoacer as king. Odoacer defeated and killed Orestes. In September of AD 476, he removed Romulus from the throne. The boy was spared because of his youth and, according to tradition, his pleasing appearance. He received an allowance and was sent to Campania. The traditional story says that Odoacer sent the Western imperial insignia to Constantinople and informed the Eastern court that the West no longer required a separate emperor. One emperor could rule the whole Roman world, while Odoacer governed Italy. The diplomatic wording was more complicated than that simple summary, but the political reality is clear. Italy no longer had a separate Western emperor. Julius Nepos, however, continued to claim the Western title from Dalmatia. The Eastern court recognized him in name until he was murdered in AD 480. The year 476 is therefore an important and convenient traditional date, but it was not a single world-ending moment recognized by every Roman at once. Odoacer retained many Roman institutions. He cooperated with the Senate and struck coins in the name of the Eastern Emperor. Roman law, landholding, churches, and urban life did not vanish overnight. When the Ostrogothic King Theodoric later defeated Odoacer, he too governed Italy through Roman administrators. The Western Roman Empire did not end because civilization suddenly went dark. The office of Western Emperor became unnecessary after a long period of political and financial blood loss. New kingdoms took possession of the outer shell, while many Roman parts continued working inside it. If you had been an ordinary resident of Italy, the change might not have begun on a single morning. Yesterday, the highest ruler named in a document was an emperor. Today, he was a king. The official collecting taxes might still use familiar Latin language. The judge settling a dispute over land might still cite Roman law. Aristocrats continued to own estates. Bishops mediated urban disputes. Senators remained proud of ancient titles. Ostrogothic rulers later claimed that Gothic soldiers would defend the state while Roman officials administered it, as though the old order might survive if its tasks were carefully divided. But deeper changes were taking place. Many Western cities lost population. Long-distance taxation and public works became harder to maintain. Roads and aqueducts fell into disrepair. Armies once paid by a single imperial government became forces tied to kings and commanders. Municipal office changed from a source of honor into a heavy obligation. Churches took on larger roles in charity, education, law, negotiation, and local government. Latin did not disappear, but its pronunciation and grammar changed in different regions until new languages slowly grew from it. People still lived inside Roman walls, but they were beginning to understand the world in new ways. This is what the disappearance of an empire truly looks like. Not every statue falls on the same day. Some institutions simply stop being repaired. Some tax registers are no longer updated. Some roads are maintained only by local communities. Some armies no longer obey commands from far away. The old world is not entirely replaced by the new. It is more like a great building whose stones are gradually removed and reused by kingdoms, churches, villages, and towns. Hundreds of explanations have been offered for the fall of Rome. Barbarian invasion, Christianity, moral corruption, slavery, lead poisoning, population decline, plague, climate change, taxation, inflation, the foreign composition of the army, administrative rigidity, and inequality. Some of these factors mattered greatly in certain places and periods. Others have been exaggerated. Any attempt to reduce a process lasting centuries with very different outcomes in East and West, to one single cause will almost certainly distort the history. It is more useful to examine how different pressures intensified one another. Politically, the empire never created a stable rule of succession. Every change of emperor could trigger civil war. Armies were repeatedly used to seize the throne instead of defending the frontiers. Financially, the West's foundation kept shrinking. Once the tax regions of North Africa, Gaul, and Spain were lost, the central government could not maintain enough troops. Military weakness then caused the loss of still more taxable territory. On the frontiers, Rome's old mechanisms for absorbing migrants and armed peoples also began to fail. The empire had once excelled at turning enemies into allies and citizens. It still tried to do this in late antiquity, but corrupt settlement, limited resources, and struggles between competing centers of power often transformed potential recruits into independent political forces. External rivals were also changing. Sasanian Persia was a powerful, organized state. Northern peoples could form larger alliances. Punic expansion pushed whole populations toward Roman borders, causing sudden surges of pressure. Epidemic disease, demographic change, and environmental fluctuation may also have weakened taxation and recruitment, although the exact scale remains debated. These pressures were less like a single hand pressing a button than additional weight piled onto structures already under strain. The different resources of East and West ultimately explain why the same storm produced different outcomes. The East possessed wealthy regions such as Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. Its cities generated stronger tax revenues. Constantinople was exceptionally difficult to capture. Eastern rulers could use money, diplomacy, and military force to redirect or defeat enemies. The West did not fall because Romans suddenly became lazy. Its political and financial system was simply less able to endure repeated shocks. The Western Empire was not killed once by one people. Over a century, it gradually lost its monopoly over taxation, armed force, and legitimacy. The year 476 is the milestone later generations chose to mark a long descent. Modern historians call the medieval empire centered on Constantinople the Byzantine Empire, which helps distinguish it from ancient Latin Rome. But the people living there usually called themselves Romans. Their state was the Empire of the Romans. Greek later became the main administrative language, and Orthodox Christianity became central to its culture, yet its people believe they inherited the political legitimacy of Constantine, Augustus, and earlier Rome. In AD 527, Justinian I became emperor. He attempted to restore Roman rule across the Mediterranean. His generals Belisarius and Narses destroyed the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, reconquered Italy after a long war against the Ostrogoths, and gained territories in southern Spain. For a brief time, the map seemed to approach the shape of the old empire. But the wars devastated Italian cities and agriculture, and the cost of holding the reconquered lands was immense. Beginning in AD 541, the plague of Justinian returned in waves, reducing population and revenue. The dream of recovering the West produced a brilliant map that the empire could not sustainably afford. Justinian's more lasting achievement was the codification of law. Jurists collected imperial constitutions, legal opinions, and teaching materials into the body of works later known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. Through it, much classical Roman legal thought survived. When Western European universities rediscovered and studied these texts in the Middle Ages, they profoundly shaped the civil law tradition. In the 7th century, Arab armies expanded with extraordinary speed. The Eastern Roman Empire lost Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and later North Africa. It changed from a Mediterranean superpower into a medieval state centered on Asia Minor and the Balkans. It reorganized defense and taxation, survived repeated attacks on Constantinople, and increasingly used Greek as the language of government. Over the following centuries, the Eastern Empire experienced revival, civil war, disputes over religious images, conflict with the Crusaders, and Turkish expansion. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade abandoned its stated objective and captured and plundered Constantinople, establishing a Latin regime. This disaster, inflicted by Christians on Christians, caused damage from which the empire never fully recovered. Roman forces recaptured Constantinople in 1261, but the old wealth and power never returned. By the 15th century, the empire controlled little beyond the capital and a small number of territories. On May 29, 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II captured the city. The last emperor, Constantine XI, disappeared or died in the fighting. From Rome's traditional founding date to the fall of Constantinople, the history of the Roman state covered more than 2,000 years. Even if we begin only with Augustus and the imperial system, the Roman Empire lasted far longer than the 5 centuries usually imagined in Western popular memory. The Eastern Empire did not survive because it hid in a back room of history. Constantinople had formidable walls. The eastern provinces were wealthier. The government could use gold, marriage, and diplomacy to turn enemies against one another. In the 6th century, Justinian made the recovery of lost territories a central mission. During the Nika riots, racing factions and political enemies nearly burned the capital to the ground. Justinian reportedly considered escape, but Empress Theodora urged him to remain. The army eventually crushed the revolt with enormous bloodshed. On the ruins rose the great church of Hagia Sophia. Its dome seemed to float in light, declaring to everyone who entered that the Roman emperor was now also the ruler of a Christian world. Justinian's armies retook North Africa and Italy, briefly restoring the outline of the old empire. The cost was devastating. The Gothic War inflicted lasting damage on Italy. Plague then returned again and again. An even greater turning point came in the 7th century. Emperor Heraclius had barely defeated Sasanian Persia after a desperate war when Arab forces expanded from the south. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa were lost in succession. The Eastern Roman Empire no longer surrounded the Mediterranean. It became a state focused on Asia Minor, the Balkans, and Constantinople. It grew smaller, but did not stop changing. The theme system connected local defense to landholding and taxation. Greek gradually became the principal language of government. The emperor still called himself Emperor of the Romans. Armies besieging Constantinople were repeatedly held back by walls, the sea, and the incendiary weapon known as Greek fire. Inside the empire, fierce controversy erupted over religious images. Emperors ordered icons destroyed. Monks and ordinary believers resisted. Theology and power remained entangled for more than a century. When the conflict ended, art and scholarship revived, while missionaries carried Eastern Christianity and written culture into the Slavic world. In the 10th and early 11th centuries, the empire again became strong. Armies recovered parts of the eastern frontier, and Basil II defeated Bulgaria. But great landowners expanded their estates, court struggles continued, and frontier systems weakened. After the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, much of the interior of Asia Minor gradually passed under Turkish control. Appeals for aid from the West helped produce the Age of the Crusades. At first, Eastern and Western Christians sometimes fought together against common enemies. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade turned against Constantinople itself. Crusaders seized relics, gold, silver, and works of art and established a Latin empire in the city. For the Eastern Romans, betrayal and plunder by fellow Christians were harder to recover from than many attacks by foreign enemies. In 1261, an exile government retook the capital. A Roman emperor once more entered the city, but the empire resembled an old ship repaired too many times. It still possessed diplomatic skill, cultural influence, and spiritual prestige. It lacked population, tax revenue, and military strength. Ottoman power spread from Asia Minor into the Balkans, and Constantinople became an island surrounded by another empire. In the spring of 1453, the young Sultan Mehmed II brought cannon to the walls. The largest weapons required long periods of cooling and reloading, but day after day, they struck fortifications that had defended the city for 1,000 years. The defenders were few. Emperor Constantine XI refused to leave. A great chain closed the entrance to the harbor. Soldiers repaired breaches. Final prayers were held in the churches. Before dawn on May 29th, the last assault began. Wave after wave pressed against the defenses until the walls were broken. The final emperor removed the symbols that would reveal his identity and entered the fighting. No one ever identified his body with certainty. This time, the office of Roman emperor did not fade through an administrative handover. It ended amid cannon fire and battle in the streets. Yet the conqueror did not simply erase the city. Mehmed II made Constantinople a capital of his own empire and considered himself, among other titles, an heir to Roman authority. Roman history completed one final familiar turn. The man who conquered Rome still wanted to wear the clothing Rome left behind. Roman law was not born as a perfect code. It accumulated through centuries of cases, statutes, praetorian practice, imperial decrees, and legal interpretation. It developed refined concepts of ownership, contract, inheritance, legal personality, litigation, and citizenship. Roman law also served a hierarchical society. It accepted slavery and patriarchal authority. It should not be romanticized as a declaration of modern human rights. But its methods of classification, legal status, procedure, and reasoning created a technical language that later societies could revise and reuse. After medieval Europe returned to the study of the corpus juris civilis, Roman law became a major foundation of the continental civil law tradition. Many modern legal terms come directly from Latin. Even the English common law tradition, which followed a different path, remained in long conversation with Roman legal thought. Rome's legal survival does not mean that every ancient rule remained unchanged. It means that later societies preserved the belief that a complex community could be organized through law that was systematic, explainable, and teachable. The saying, "all roads lead to Rome," was never literally true of every road, but it accurately captured the centrality of the Roman network. Roads first served armies and official communication, but also carried merchants, travelers, administrators, religions, and disease. Romans built bridges, harbors, aqueducts, baths, drainage systems, and public squares, making infrastructure a visible proof of government. Legions did more than fight. Soldiers built camps, fortifications, parts of roads, bridges, and waterworks. They patrolled, escorted travelers, and performed administrative tasks. Yet the larger system of construction and maintenance also depended on local communities, contractors, and compulsory labor. The army did not build every Roman road by itself. The army's advantage was never that one weapon or formation remained permanently superior. Its strength was organization, recruitment, training, engineering, standard camps, logistics, rewards, punishment, records, and the ability to learn. Roman forces lost to Hannibal, Parthian horse archers, and Gothic armies, but repeatedly adapted. Later states inherited Roman images of discipline, unit numbers, eagles, military ceremony, and engineering troops. They also used Roman power as a political symbol. Yet the most important inheritance was not armor. It was the connection between the army, finance, roads, law, and citizenship. Latin developed into the Romance languages and remained the language of church, law, and scholarship in medieval Western Europe. English is not a Romance language, but absorbed an enormous Latin vocabulary through French, Christianity, law, and education. The Eastern Roman world preserved Greek as its main language, transmitted classical Greek texts, and profoundly influenced Orthodox Christianity and the Renaissance. Christianity began in Judea under Roman rule. It was persecuted by Roman authorities, then supported by Roman emperors, and eventually made the empire's official religion. Roman roads, cities, and shared languages helped the early church spread. Dioceses and councils also made some use of imperial administrative patterns. After central government weakened in the West, bishops and local churches took on greater social and political responsibilities. Roman arches, concrete, domes, amphitheaters, basilica halls, and monumental columns have been imitated for centuries. Modern parliaments, courthouses, railway stations, and memorials frequently use columns and domes because these forms became a visual language of order, public life, and state authority. Rome also left warnings through its darker inheritance. Great public works may depend on taxation and forced labor. Peace may rest on conquest. Citizen freedom can coexist with slavery. Law can be sophisticated and still unequal. To understand Rome is not to worship Rome. It is to see how cultural achievement and the cost of violence can exist together. Now, at last, we can fill in the death certificate that seemed impossible at the beginning. Rome did not rise because it possessed the purest people, the most perfect constitution, or an army that never lost. Quite the opposite. From birth, it was a mixed society. It learned continuously from Etruscans, Greeks, Sabines, and the peoples of Italy. The Republic was filled with hierarchy and conflict. Roman legions suffered catastrophic defeats again and again. Rome's real power was its ability to keep organizing people and resources. An army could disappear at Cannae, but citizen records, allied treaties, roads, and annual offices would produce another army. Roman inclusion was unequal, but it could expand. Yesterday's enemy might become today's ally. The children of allies might become citizens. Provincial elites could enter the Senate. Men born in Spain, North Africa, and the Balkans could become emperor. Rome also reproduced systems of cities, taxation, law, military bases, and cooperation with local elites, connecting immense distances in an age without modern communication. More than that, Rome knew how to tell its own story. It turned disaster into a test of loyalty, victory in civil war into the restoration of peace, monarchy into the vocabulary of republican government, and the many different fates of conquered peoples into one shared world. People obeyed because of armies, of course, but they also joined because Roman rule could offer status, commerce, security, and a possible path upward. The fall of the Western Empire was the reversal of those abilities, one after another. Continuous mobilization was consumed by civil war. The mechanisms of inclusion broke down under corruption and scarcity. Replicated institutions became local powers acting on their own. The common story could no longer conceal that emperors had become hostages of generals. When the empire could no longer protect land reliably, it could not collect taxes. Without taxes, it could not maintain armies. Without armies, it had to give land and authority to groups capable of fighting. Once those groups built local power, they no longer needed a Western emperor. In AD 476, Odoacer did not cut down a living tree full of leaves. He merely removed the final imperial nameplate from a trunk that had already dried. But Rome never completely disappeared, because its greatest creation was not only a border. It was a set of tools that its enemies could inherit. Gothic kings used Roman officials. Frankish rulers sought Roman legitimacy. The church used Roman cities and the Latin language. Eastern subjects continued calling themselves Romans. Modern states still borrow the vocabulary of republic, citizen, senate, and written law. Legend says that Rome received life from the milk of a she-wolf. In real history, it grew by absorbing the strength of others. Its political body dissolved in the West, but its institutions, languages, and imagination were consumed, digested, and transformed by countless heirs into a new world. So the final answer of Roman history is not simply an answer to the question, why did an empire fall? It is another, more intriguing question. If the conquerors, heirs, and critics of a civilization must all use the language it left behind to describe themselves, can that civilization truly be called dead? Rome's last emperor left the stage long ago, but the Roman performance is still going on. And now, at last, we have reached the end of this long and gentle journey through the complete history of the Roman Empire. From the legend of twins nursed by a she-wolf beside the Tiber, to the young emperor who took off the purple robe and lived quietly by the southern sea, more than 2,000 years of history have finally turned their last page. The fire is burning low. The only thing left to do is rest. If you are still awake, you do not need to keep trying. Another quiet story is waiting on the screen. Whenever you are ready, you can drift into the next one and fall asleep with us. If you enjoyed this video, you are welcome to like and subscribe, or leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let the strangers who discover this quiet corner tomorrow know how many people once traveled this long road together. But leave all of that for the morning. Let your shoulders sink completely into the bed. Let each breath become a little slower. Gently close your eyes and allow the vast and ancient history of Rome to settle softly into the darkness. I'm Jason from the Eastern Historian. Good night and sweet dreams. The next story will be waiting quietly whenever you are ready.